Hello everyone, and welcome back to our fourth and final module on emotion. So in this chapter we just went through a bunch of motivation stuff. We talked about motives for hunger, motives for sex, motives for social belonging and achievements, and the final module in this chapter is going to be on emotion. So we're going to talk through a few of the theories of emotion that have been proposed over the years, talk a little bit about the universality of certain types of emotions, and that'll be it for chapter 11. So the term emotion is actually kind of complex to define because it does encompass so many different things, but common convention in psychology is to define it as being a behavior with the following three components. So these are the three key things you're looking for when defining emotion. There's a subjective thought and or experience with accompanying patterns of neural activity and physiological arousal, and an observable behavioral expression. So it could be a facial expression, changes in muscle tension, something that's kind of conveying that emotion to others. So you're going to get the thought and the experience of, saying I'm feeling sad. That's going to accompany, certain neural pathways and certain things will kind of be activated within your body, and then you typically have some kind of facial expression or body language that's going to help you convey that emotion to others. So when we're talking about the physiology of emotion, there are several different areas of the nervous system that are involved in emotion. So basically we need to talk about how these different areas work together to produce emotional behaviors. And emotional behaviors are actually really important. They've been part of kind of our adaptation in terms of evolution because they can actually help us survive in terms of kind of knowing how to read other people's emotions and knowing what they're trying to convey. It can be really important to kind of be able to take in those messages and understand what's being conveyed. So the human brain shows emotion-dependent responses within approximately 150 milliseconds of seeing or hearing a potential threat. So those reactions that we have to potentially threatening stimuli are, kind of completely immediate. They're so fast that sometimes you don't even notice they're occurring. So this initial brain activity serves to tag or highlight the stimulus so that it receives extra processing. So basically you see something that could be a potential threat and your brain kind of automatically warns you, hey, there's something that we should be paying more attention to because it could potentially be threatening. A critical brain area, and you've heard me talk about this one many times before, but in terms of emotion, the amygdala is one of the most kind of heavily implicated brain areas. It's a group of nuclei in the medial portion of the temporal lobes, and it's in each hemisphere of the brain, and it receives sensory inputs from the cortex approximately 200 milliseconds after appearance. So again, very, very quickly, a fraction of a second, and that information is received by the amygdala. So the amygdala fires when we perceive stimuli that are emotionally arousing, but this firing on its own does very little. So it doesn't really do a whole lot in terms of the fact that it's firing, but it does kind of project and pass on messages to other brain structures, and that's what leads to our observable emotional responses. So the amygdala basically sends feedback to sensory areas so that they can fire more, which results in more attention being paid to the potentially emotional stimuli. So again, if it's something that could be perceived as threatening to us in some way or something we should pay attention to, the amygdala is able to kind of highlight that and say, hey, pay attention to this. It could be something important to kind of keep an eye on. So in order to prepare our body to physically respond to a threat, the autonomic nervous system, which we talked about a lot in the last course, activates the sympathetic nervous system. And if you remember, the sympathetic nervous system is the one that's really involved in that fight or flight response. If you then discover that you're not in immediate danger, so for example, you were walking down the street at night, you heard a sound, and then you realize it's just kind of like a bird behind you or something, and you're no longer feeling like you're in danger, then your parasympathetic nervous system is the one that activates and helps you return to a normal state. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems actually kind of act opposite to each other. So the sympathetic kind of speeds you up, gets you ready for action, whereas the parasympathetic kind of slows everything back down to normal. So here's just a little figure that kind of shows you a bit about how the emotional elements of a scene can attract our attention. So for example, if this guy is walking along and he sees this snake in front of him, basically what's going to happen is the sensory cortex, so the visual cortex in this case, having seen the snake, will send signals to the amygdala And then the feedback from the amygdala is what causes an increase in sensory regions, such as the visual cortex as well as other. So basically what it's doing is it's causing you to pay more attention to that stimuli that could be potentially threatening. And so basically you've got kind of this feedback loop where these areas continue to influence each other, and you either pay attention to the threat and notice it is a threat and find some way to deal with it, or you are able to determine it's not a threat, and then your parasympathetic nervous system is activated and everything kind of calms back down. You don't need to know a whole lot about kind of the brain responses in emotion, but it is important to know that, the amygdala is that area that's really heavily implicated in emotions, particularly when we're talking about things like fear and aggression responses. And here's a little diagram that kind of shows you the autonomic nervous system and emotional responding. So again, this is something that we talked about back in chapter, I believe it was 3, when we did all our biological psychology stuff. So just to keep in mind, your sympathetic nervous system basically does things that prepare you for action. So dilating your pupils, your mouth drying, you're having sweaty palms and dilated passages in your lungs, increased heart rate. All of those things are basically happening to help prepare you in case you need to fight or flee. And then the parasympathetic nervous system acts the opposite of that and kind of slows everything back down after the threat has passed, or after you've determined that the stimulus isn't actually a threat. The nervous system, as we just kind of talked about, helps prepare your body to make a movement in response to the emotion you are experiencing. And we do see an increase in brain activities in areas related to planning movement. So once your nervous system has been activated, especially that amygdala, we do see that there's more activation in areas that are kind of responsible for the planning of your movement as well. So they're getting you ready to kind of move and remove yourself from the situation if you need to. It does make sense from a survival standpoint for us to have very rapid emotional responses and then decide if they are correct or not. So if you've got an animal or even another person running towards you and they have an angry look on their face, you need to be able to respond to that really quickly, right? Because otherwise that could mean harm or even death for you. So the constant communication between these brain areas is very important in terms of being a really important characteristic of our emotional system, and it explains why we can sometimes feel emotionally out of control, while at other times we feel calm, cool, and collected. So because we have all this feedback kind of going on in our brain constantly, that explains why we kind of exhibit and experience such a wide range of emotions. So here's a little experiment that you can try if you'd like, and we'll talk a bit more about it a little later on the notes. But if you take a straw or a pencil and try to hold it in your mouth sideways without letting your lips touch it, just try that for a second if you'd like, and kind of think about how you feel, how it makes you feel. And then on the opposite side of that, if you want to hold it in your lips without it touching your teeth, I'll give you a second if you'd like to try that out. You can pause the video as well if you'd like. And kind of just do that for a few seconds and reflect on how that makes you feel. And so there is a really important reason behind this, and we'll get into it in a few minutes when we get a little bit further in the module, but I want you to just keep that in mind if it kind of aroused any emotional response in you. So we're going to talk now about some of the theories of emotion. The earliest theory of emotions was the James Lange theory of emotion, which was of course named for two researchers, James and Lange. And they basically suggested that our physiological reactions to stimuli, for example, a racing heart, precede the emotional experience, for example, the fear. So in other words, basically what James and Lange were saying is that your feelings follow your physiological response. So for example, if you're walking down the street at night and you hear a noise like a branch crack behind you, first your heart starts racing and you might start breathing faster, your palms might start sweating, and then you feel the experience of fear. So basically the physiological will kind of precede and cause the subjective feeling of saying, I feel scared. So the James Lange theory claims that your feelings of fear are determined by how your body responds. However, there were several prominent researchers in the same era who disagreed with James and Lange, so we'll talk a bit about their theories as well. Walter Cannon and Philip Bard are another two researchers whose names are really important in terms of the discussion of theories of emotion. So they noted that some of the internal organs involved in emotional feelings could not respond quickly enough to be the first step in an emotional response. So it was clear that sometimes we're able to kind of feel an emotion before our body might even really get a chance to react. And so they also kind of notice that the feedback from the body may not be specific enough to create the different emotions that we experience. So for example, if you have like a racing heart, that could be fear, but it could also be excitement, right? So sometimes our physiological responses aren't really specific enough to lend themselves to a certain emotion. So the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion suggests that the brain interprets a situation and generates subjective emotional feelings, and that these representations in the brain trigger the responses in the body. So instead of what James Lange said, where they were basically saying that, you know, you feel the physiological and then you get the emotional experience, the Cannon-Bard theory says that your brain is able to interpret the situation and generate the feeling, and then it's that generation of, you know, I feel scared, I feel angry, whatever, that triggers the response of the body. So kind of almost the opposite of what James and Lange were saying. But they did say that these processes occur very quickly, almost simultaneously. So they wouldn't really say that you feel the emotion and then your body starts to react, you know, a couple seconds later. They're kind of almost happening at the exact same time. And for several decades, this was actually one of the most widely accepted views of our emotional behavior. So I'll show you a little diagram now that kind of illustrates the difference between the two. So you can see in the first half here, the James Lange theory, you've got a dog that's, you know, snarling at somebody. So of course the first step is to perceive the stimulus. You see it, you hear it. And so in James Lange theory, the emotional expression and the physiological response will occur. And then you get that experience of emotion, so that experience of fear. So in their case, they're saying that, you know, you get the expression in your eyes and you pop open and you get the racing heart and, you know, the sweaty palms, and that's what leads to your experience of fear. Whereas the Cannon-Bard theory would say that you see the stimulus, you know, you're perceiving it, so you're seeing it, you're hearing the dog, and then your emotional expression and physiological response occur, but also your emotional experience of fear occur, and they kind of occur pretty much at the same time. So it isn't just like one preceding the other, like in the James Lange theory. So basically you're both making the expression and having the physiological response, but at the same time you're experiencing that emotion that you would consider to be fear. So in times that Cannon-Bard theory also saw limitations, and actually if you look at the difference between the two, the James Lange theory actually has more empirical support, so it is more backed up by the research evidence, likely due to the fact that some of the bodily feedback involved in emotion is caused by facial responses. So it does make sense that, you know, we would have those expressions and we would have those feelings in our body, which would kind of contribute to our experience of emotion. So the facial feedback hypothesis suggests that our emotional expressions can actually influence our subjective emotional states. And that one is really interesting, and it's something that has been documented in a lot of studies and a lot of research. You know, people kind of often tell you, oh, you know, smile, like you'll feel better. And while that's a pretty condescending remark to make, it may actually have some truth to it. Because it does seem to be that when people make, you know, a certain facial expression, say if they're smiling or they're frowning or they make an angry expression, they do actually sometimes, or I guess a lot of the time, start to experience that emotion. And so that kind of relates back to what I had you try a few slides ago, where, you know, you're holding the pencil in certain positions. So if you're holding it in a position where it makes your mouth kind of frown or make kind of an angry expression, then that might actually lead you feeling kind of a heightened sense of anger. And if it makes you, if it leads to an expression that makes you kind of smile and look like you would be happy, then it can actually lead to you feeling a little happier. So it has been shown that people who are made to make those facial expressions, just like you would have been, can actually experience changes in their mood. And other researchers have kind of tested the opposite of that. So they want to see, you know, if obviously we can kind of trigger emotions by making people kind of engage in certain facial expressions, if somebody is unable to engage in facial expressions, can that kind of dull their emotions? And of course, somebody who's gotten a Botox injection, they're not able to really move their forehead or parts of their face as much, so they wouldn't necessarily be able to make some of the same emotional expressions. And these researchers have actually found similar results in terms of the fact that individuals who have had Botox and aren't really able to exhibit that wider range of facial expressions, they actually seem to experience a lot of emotions less intensely. But it is important to note that some emotions don't seem to be as affected by others. So it's not, or sorry, as affected as others. So it's not, you know, perfect research. It doesn't show with certainty, you know, that was the kind of reason the Botox injections are what's leading to those kind of decreases in emotional reaction. But it definitely is something that kind of makes you think about the validity of saying, you know, making a certain expression can actually lead to influence your experience of a particular emotion. So yeah, this is just a figure that kind of illustrates those facial expressions that we were talking about, using those examples that I gave you a few slides ago. So if you haven't tried them out and you want to, just give it a try and see how you feel, because you may find that your facial expressions that you're making actually do influence your emotions in some way. So now we're going to talk about one of the most recent and most widely accepted theories of emotion, which is the two-factor theory of emotion. So Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer were two researchers who actually agreed with James and Lang that our physical reactions give rise to our emotional experience, but they suggested that it is our interpretation of why we are aroused that creates emotion. So basically, up until now, when we talk about the Cannon-Bard and the James-Lang theory, it's basically got a lot to do with our physical reactions and our emotional expressions and how they lead to our subjective experience of emotion. But neither one of those theories actually takes into account the role that cognitions can play, so our thought processes and how we interpret things. So Schachter and Singer were the first ones to kind of really think about, well, obviously, our thinking and our cognitions, our ways of interpreting things, can really influence our emotions as well. So they basically created this two-factor theory of emotion that states that patterns of physical arousal and the cognitive labels that we attach to them form the basis of our emotional experiences. So along with physical arousal, when our heart starts to race or our palms start to sweat or our breathing starts to increase, we think to ourselves, okay, I'm probably scared, I'm probably excited. We have a thought that kind of indicates to us what emotion we could potentially be feeling. And that, Schachter and Singer would say, is what kind of influences us to determine what emotion it is that we're experiencing. So they actually performed a few really interesting studies in which participants were given cognitive labels for the same feeling. And they found that when the participant was aware of the potential effects of the drug that they'd been given, they were less likely to attribute their reactions to emotion. So basically what they did is they injected a few different groups of participants with adrenaline. And as you may know, if you inject someone with adrenaline, it's going to kind of increase their heart rate, increase their respiration. It kind of speeds up the nervous system. So basically, they had one group in which they informed. They said, we're going to give you this shot. It's probably going to make you, your heart start to race and things like this start to happen. So they kind of explained to them what should happen. The other group was ignorant. They didn't really tell them what side effects, if any, to expect from the shot. And then the third group were misinformed. So they were actually told that they would have different effects that weren't things that would correspond to the effects of adrenaline. And so what they ended up finding is that they then placed these participants in a waiting room, and they had to kind of await, their participation in the study, which of course the whole thing itself was actually the study. And so they had someone in the waiting room who was acting kind of really silly and kind of throwing papers around, and basically what they found is that the individuals who were informed about the effects of the adrenaline, they tended not to really react negatively towards this person who was kind of jumping around and doing all these silly things in the room, and behaving in a way which was kind of considered to be annoying. And so the ones who knew that their racing heart and whatever was due to the adrenaline, they didn't really experience such an emotional reaction. But the ones who weren't aware that the adrenaline was going to cause them those impacts, well, they of course were still experiencing the racing heart and all those types of things, but they attributed those feelings to being angry at the person who was annoying them. And so they were actually more likely to exhibit that emotional reaction towards, this man who was actually kind of an actor and part of the experiment. But basically, because they didn't have a logical reason to say, to explain why they would be having a racing heart and these types of things, they assumed it must be because they were feeling anger. So in that way, it's exactly what's being talked about in the two-factor theory here, that once you feel those sensations, it's your actual interpretation of them and what they might mean that can lead you to exhibiting that emotional reaction. So you can kind of see in figure 11.19 here the results of that study that I was just talking about. So if the participants knew their racing heart was due to the drug, they didn't really have kind of an angry behavior. They didn't really act out towards the man who was acting kind of silly and a little bit annoying in the waiting room with them. But you can see the ones who were ignorant, they weren't aware that they had been given or what they had been given would cause those types of physiological reactions. Well, when they experienced that racing heart and those types of things, they assumed it was because they were annoyed by the man. They were much more likely to act out in an angry way towards him. And then in figure 11.18 here, you can see kind of a little diagram similar to the ones that we looked at for the other two theories of emotion. But basically the two-factor theory would say that the stimulus is perceived and it's accompanied by that biological response or physiological response. Then we have a cognitive appraisal, so our brain starts to think, okay, why would our heart be racing right now? Oh, we must be scared. And then that's what leads to that conscious feeling of fear. So there's an actual kind of thought component rather than just a physical reaction and an emotional response. However, this study, the one with the injections of adrenaline, it didn't really show whether the results would apply to the real world. So researchers from the University of British Columbia performed an innovative experiment that provided more strong support for the two-factor theory. So basically what they did is they took a bunch of people to the Capilano suspension bridges in BC, which are kind of a really high suspension bridge, really high, really long, and can be quite scary for a lot of people to kind of walk across those bridges. And so they had some participants that they made kind of walk on a much lower, kind of more safe bridge that wasn't really scary, and then they had other participants walk on one of the highest bridges that was kind of went across a long way, and it was a little bit scary. It was something that would cause a lot of people quite a great deal of fear. And so then after they had either walked on the low safe bridge or the high scary bridge, they were asked to participate in what's called a thematic apperception test. And this is kind of an implicit test where basically they give you a picture and you're supposed to tell a story based on what you see in the picture. So you basically make up a story based on kind of the prompt from the picture. And what they found is that the participants who were in the experimental condition, which is the one that was on the really high bridge, that was kind of scary, they included significantly more sexual imagery in their stories on the subsequent TAT test. And what that might be attributed to is the fact that when they were on the high bridge, they probably had a racing heart and kind of, shallow breathing and started to have those physiological responses that could either be attributed as fear or excitement. And so then when they were asked to look at these pictures, they kind of attributed, they kind of started, feeling excitement based on this experience that they'd had with the bridge and having this physiological reaction. So they were more likely to kind of put sexual scenarios into their story that they were telling. And there was another aspect of that study in which not only were the people on the high bridge more likely to include sexual content in their stories, they actually did kind of a further manipulation where at the end of the experiment, they gave the participants the number of the female experimenter, so kind of a attractive young female who had been part of the experiment, and the ones who had been on the high bridge were more likely to give her a call, which kind of indicated that when they had that physiological experience that goes along with being on the high bridge, which is probably because they were scared, but because they had this reaction and they were starting to feel this racing heart and stuff, they attributed it to being attracted, to being excited about the person, so they were more likely to call her because they kind of felt more attracted to her after having this physiological response, even though it probably had nothing to do with the level of attractiveness. It was more to do with the fear of being on this really high and potentially dangerous bridge. So it was really interesting how the way that these men chose to attribute that physiological reaction could influence their responses on subsequent tasks. So overall, these studies of the two-factor theory show us that it is our interpretation of our physiological responses that lead to our emotional experiences, not the actual experience themselves and the physiological response itself. So now we'll talk briefly about expressing emotion. So I don't think we've really talked about it so far in these classes, but I used to have a section in one of the chapters about polygraph tests, which are lie detector tests. They've been proven very inaccurate in terms of being a measure of when a person is lying. It's very easy for somebody who knows how a polygraph test works to be able to kind of beat it in a variety of ways, and it's also very possible that a lot of the time it will pick up on false positives in terms of people lying because people are scared, and basically the main kind of indicator for if somebody's lying on one of these tests is their level of physiological arousal. So of course, if people are nervous, they're going to be exhibiting that same kind of arousal they might exhibit when they were lying. So there's a lot of reasons why polygraph tests can't really be trusted. But there was a psychologist named Paul Ekman and his colleagues, and they developed a new method of lie detection. So they actually found that there are certain things, certain expressions that we make and things to do with our faces that can give us away when we're lying. So although we are able to fake emotional responses readily, so we're able to kind of put on a smile even if we're angry or we're upset sometimes, or, you know, fake being sad even if something kind of really brings us joy. But Ekman basically says that the real emotion can be seen just for, you know, maybe nanoseconds on our face right before our fake emotional response or our mask comes into place. So Ekman called these brief expressions of our true feelings micro-emotions. So basically it's like you're showing it for a brief kind of fraction of a second before you're able to kind of make the appropriate emotional response in terms of your facial expression. So our primary method of expressing our emotional feelings is through our facial expressions. But something you might be wondering is, why are certain combinations of muscle movements associated with particular feelings? And there may be actual evolutionary advantages there as well. So, you know, if we have someone coming towards us, and I kind of gave this example earlier, but if we have, you know, we're out hunting or whatever back in our ancestors' times, and we see someone coming towards us and they have kind of an angry expression on their face, we need to be able to recognize what that means. Because, you know, if they come towards us with a big grin on their face versus they come towards us with kind of a snarl, like they're going to attack us, those are very important things to be able to distinguish. So it might be that because being able to recognize certain expressions gave us kind of that advantage in terms of being able to kind of determine whether something was dangerous for you, and you know, you'd be more likely to avoid those kind of confrontations, that could have led to the ability to kind of have common facial expressions and be able to interpret them being something that was really important to pass down during our evolutionary history. And one other thing I will mention while we're on this slide, if you are interested, you know, even with the whole micro-expression way of telling people are lying and stuff, it's obviously not perfect. It doesn't work 100% of the time. A lot of studies have shown that people who are trained in, you know, catching these micro-expressions don't really perform better than chance in a lot of scenarios. But if it is something that kind of interests you, there was a show called Lie to Me. I'm not sure if it's on a streaming service now, but it used to be available like years ago. I remember watching it during my master's, and it's kind of based on Paul Ekman's work. It's, you know, it's a guy who basically can tell if people are lying to him just by kind of watching the reactions and things like that, and he uses it to help him solve crimes. So not super scientifically based, but definitely was an interesting show and kind of relates to what we're talking about here. And so these basically just show some of the different facial expressions that we might make and how they're associated with certain emotions. And so not only, as I was talking about earlier, is it important to be able to recognize emotion in terms of keeping yourself safe from a potential confrontation, but there are also other evolutionary advantages that might come along with certain facial expressions that we've evolved over time. So for example, when somebody is disgusted or thinks something smells gross, they tend to scrunch up their nose. And actually what scrunching up your nose does, you know, in addition to conveying the emotion that you're disgusted, it actually decreases the airflow in your nostrils, which makes sense because typically in our evolutionary history, a lot of things that smell bad might have been poisonous. They might have been toxic to us. So therefore, it would make sense that our reaction is something that basically kind of impacts the airflow into our nose and kind of makes it so we can't actually smell as much of that smell. So if that was something that was toxic to us, then we are kind of experiencing it less by kind of scrunching up your nose in that way. And the opposite of that would be the flared nostrils that we see sometimes when people are scared or fear. And you can see this kind of on the right side of the picture here. And so it makes sense that the nostrils would flare if you're in a situation that might be threatening and causes you fear, because that can help us take in more oxygen and take in more information and help us kind of prepare for action. So whether we have to engage in that kind of fight or flight response. So not only are these emotions and these emotional expressions important for us to be able to recognize emotion, but they can actually provide evolutionary advantages in and of themselves as well. So it's really important to note that we do see similar facial expressions existing all over the world. I mean, there are some differences in terms of culture, but individuals from one culture tend to be able to identify expressions of what we call kind of the universal emotions on the faces of individuals from other cultures all over the world. So things such as fear, happiness, disgust, anger, surprise, and sadness are some of the emotions that are kind of considered universal. And so even if somebody wasn't from your culture and they're displaying these type of emotions, you'd be very likely to be able to recognize them, which again might kind of relate back to the fact that a lot of these emotional expressions did provide us with some type of evolutionary advantage in our history. So we also communicate our emotions through body language as well. It is possible to see differences in movement of men versus women. So if you're watching, somebody, like it's just kind of they've hooked people up to those machines that monitor their body movements and then showed people kind of a rendering of people walking, and it's actually pretty easy to tell if it's a man or a woman walking just by looking at kind of the movements. People who are happy versus sad, we can definitely see differences in their body language, maybe the head hanging down versus kind of walking along with a hop in your step, and even nervous versus relaxed people. So we are able to identify a lot of these basic emotions just based on people's body language as well. Interestingly, we do see that many aspects of body language and body motion appear to be universal as well. So again, it really seems like there's something within our evolutionary history that was making it advantageous for us to be able to express and recognize these emotions, to the point that, we developed a lot of these universal expressions regardless of culture and location. So for the end of this section, we're going to talk briefly about culture and emotion. So we're going to talk about the way that cultures are influence what emotions are displayed and what emotions are acceptable, as well as some of the display rules for each culture. So we know that every cultural group has its own unique emotional dialect, which are basically variations across cultures in how common emotions are expressed. So for example, if you are in West Africa, in a place called Gabon, there's an expression, if you kind of curled your upper lip, that would express contempt or express kind of that you were kind of disgusted or not impressed with what somebody was saying to you. Whereas in North American culture, we tend to lower our brow to express contempt. So there are definitely cultural variations, and we see them through those emotional dialects in how certain emotions are expressed. Display rules refer to the written expectations we have regarding when it is appropriate to show a certain emotion. So for example, in North America, if we are very embarrassed, if something happens and we're kind of ashamed of it, then we tend to blush. It tends to be pretty easy to look at someone from our culture and determine whether or not they're feeling embarrassed. Whereas in a country like Japan, sometimes, emotions like embarrassment aren't seen as acceptable or as acceptable as they are in our culture, and so they would be much more likely to try to kind of smile and not really indicate that they were feeling embarrassed. So that's kind of what we're referring to when we say display rules. It's the rules, the unwritten expectations that each culture has, each group has, about when and where it's appropriate to express emotions, if at all. Cross-culturally, participants seem to agree about a person's emotional state when viewing high-intensity emotions. So again, especially those kind of basic emotions that we were talking about earlier, they tend to be pretty easy to kind of recognize regardless of cultural background. But it's kind of interesting that they differed when emotions were less intense. So if you showed a picture to a North American and someone from Japan of somebody who was smiling with like kind of a really big happy face, like smiling expression on their face, and then you ask them to rate kind of the intensity of the emotion, then both of them in that case are probably going to rate the level of emotion as pretty high. If you then showed them a picture of someone who was kind of half smiling, they looked happy but didn't kind of look nearly as happy as in the first picture, a North American person would be more inclined to look at that picture and say, well, that person is experiencing that happiness less intensely. So say if they were a 10 in the first picture, they're probably a 5 in this picture. Whereas a Japanese participant might actually say, you know what, they're probably experiencing the same level of emotion, but they're not in an appropriate situation where they can display that emotion. So based on those display rules, that can kind of indicate, not only if you can show an emotion, but how intensely you can show it. So they'd be more likely to say that the person was feeling the same level of happiness in both scenarios, but in the second scenario, they weren't able to express it as readily based on the display rules of that particular situation. And cultural display rules can vary over time. So for example, smiling in photos is something that we kind of take for granted now as something you just do. You say cheese, you smile when you're in a photo, but years ago, smiling in photos was actually something that wasn't really that popular. And you can kind of see that here in this picture. So it kind of shows the average photographs of male and female high school students from 1900 to the present decade. And you can see that honestly, up until, maybe the 1910s, 1920s, people didn't really smile at all in their photographs. And even after that, for the next few decades, they didn't really, make the big exaggerated smiles that we do in our photographs today. So not only does each culture and each kind of society have their own rules around displaying emotions and experiencing emotions, but they can also vary over time as well. Some cultures, for example, Western cultures such as ours, focus on the person expressing the emotion, whereas other cultures, so for example some Asian cultures, tend to pay attention to those surrounding the person. So this is kind of the final point to make for this section here, and it does relate back to those display rules and how we interpret emotional expressions. And so if you asked, again, somebody from a North American culture to look at figure 11.22 or 11.22 and tell you how the man in the middle of the pictures is feeling, well, if they're looking at him, they're going to say, okay, you know what, he looks like he's pretty happy in both pictures. Maybe a little happier in the first picture, but definitely he's feeling happy in both of those images. Whereas if you ask somebody from a lot of Asian cultures, so more Eastern cultures, to tell you how that person in the middle was feeling, in the first picture, they're likely to tell you that he's feeling very happy. They're looking at everyone around him too, and they all look very happy. In the second picture, they'd actually be likely to tell you that he is feeling happy, but at the expense of those around him. And that's because our culture is much more individualistic. If we're asked how he's feeling, we're looking at his face. We're not really considering as much the people around him. Whereas in a more collectivist culture, like many Asian cultures are, if they're looking at this picture, they're not just considering the individual in the middle, they're considering the group as a whole. So everyone that they're seeing in that picture. And so if they're looking at it, they're more likely to notice the sad expressions on the faces of the other people and assume that if the guy in the middle is happy, he's happy at the expense of those around him. So they're kind of more likely to look at that group rather than the individuals. And we kind of see this reflected in 11.23 as well. So in comparison to Asian people, Westerners spend a lot more time looking at the focal individual in a scene, and they interpret his or her emotions without reference to surrounding individuals. So again, we're more likely to just look at the middle person and not really pay attention to what the other ones are doing, whereas they're more likely to consider the group as a whole. And interestingly enough, if you were to test someone from an Eastern culture versus a Western culture afterwards on who the background members in the photograph were, so if you were to show them a lineup and ask them to pick out who they saw, they would be much more likely to be able to identify the people who were in the background of the photograph than would a Westerner, because again, we are more likely to have that individualistic focus on the main person in the picture rather than kind of taking in information about all of the individuals. And that is it for emotion, and that is actually the end of chapter 11 in general. So hopefully you enjoyed our chapter on emotion and motivation. I know it's a lot of information. None of these lectures are really short. They're all, at least a half an hour, and I think this one is actually the longest at this point. But I think personally that it's a really interesting topic, so I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something new. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. So I will end it for now, and I will talk to you in chapter 12, where we'll start to discuss personality.